Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stone, immaculate.
And welcome to today's webinar, Designing Fault-Tolerant Applications.
So today we'd like to talk to you about building fault-tolerant applications using the Amazon Web Services. Much of the material in today's presentation is drawn from a white paper of the same name that we published last year. This white paper is available in the new AWS Architecture Center, and we will give you a link to that at the end of this presentation. Our goal today is to share our knowledge and our best practices, and we want to make sure that we impart that knowledge over to you. And we'd also like to hear back from you. So as you listen, please feel free to contribute your observations through the comments. And later in this week, we will be emailing you. And please feel free to reply and let us know your comments and any best practices that you've discovered that you would like to share with us and with your peers as well.
In Paris, in 1937, the Nazi Ambassador Otto Arbites pointed to the painting Guernica and asked Picasso, "Did you do that?" Picasso very appropriately responded, "No, you did." Radio Tipping Point. Our show today is titled Tolerant to a Fault. Mike Boyle at the controls. And this word tolerant has a number of meanings that I thought it was quite interesting in, again, preparing for this show, understanding what are the different types of meanings that we can actually apply to this word. Of course, there's the question of how much we can absorb, usually tied to alcohol or drugs, or perhaps it might be sleep deprivation. And that is considered to be tolerant, that you are able to manage a lot. And then from the technical perspective, either from construction or perhaps from IT, we talk about fault tolerance. How much can we, within our system or within our edifice, how much can we allow for discrepancies and not lose the plot? And I think it's quite interesting to look at these two ways of defining the word tolerant or tolerance and use it in a different context. The one that we probably know the best, and that is the question of tolerance within our society, or lack thereof. There is currently a book that I'm going through right now titled Anarchy, State, and Utopia. The name of the author is Robert Nozick, and he refers to this difficulty that we have in being thankful, joyous, appreciative of the abilities of others, because we consider all this is to be measurable, and that's part of the conditioning we've been going through. Because if we can't measure it, it has no value. And so we are constantly comparing ourselves to others, although they are coming from completely different directions. We all have different abilities. but we tend to discount the abilities that we have. We are worried that they are in decline, that we are on the path of disability, where we are losing the capability of performing different actions. And this is the threat that we have in the back of our minds constantly. And in fact, we always think that the others have more than what we have. And so the author Nozick alludes to this situation and says it's really based on envy, that we're envious of the abilities of others. Although, let's be honest, we're not all born the same way, thank goodness. And it doesn't have to be this way. What does the subject of tolerance, what does it have to do with identity, or lack thereof? Last week we talked about the consuming conditioning in its various forms, and the role that we play in being a consumer or a producer. Whereas if we were to dig deeper and figure out what the antithesis of that role of consumer or producer, either one, what would that be? That would really be tied to the uniqueness that each one of us actually has. So on that gold standard that I would wish for all of us within our society is that we are able to accept others and their abilities without it being a threat. Following the usual approach that we have towards this word tolerance, it's very much tied to conversations or heated discussions sometimes, where others might have different opinions than ourselves. And the question that I would pose is, why is it so difficult for us to just acknowledge that there are different approaches, different ways of looking at things, different opinions that individuals can have, that does not negate our own? And I hope that this isn't too much of a shock when I say this, but there could be multiple right answers, and there could also be multiple wrong answers. And the answer could be right or wrong depending upon the situation. So really, when you look at this deeply, you come to the conclusion that we keep giving this concept of inclusion, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Inclusion means that not only do we have a diverse society, but these various individuals or groups within society, they actually have something to say that's listened to, and might even be accepted, and maybe could even be seen as being a benefit for us in our society. But the real issue is that we don't have the structures to really make it happen. So let's take a step down memory lane and thinking about not only how did we end up in this situation, and let's be honest, envy is not something that's a 20th century, 21st century phenomena, But it's all tied to this estrangement that's been taking place. The whole idea of a nation state really isn't all that old. It started about 200 years ago and built up quite a bit of momentum around 1918. But before that, it was the town was our community. That means that sense of identity was clearly tied to those individuals that we knew. And within that community, it would be a lie to say that everybody was the same, quite the opposite. And it doesn't mean that people got along all the time. Very often there were feuds. Very often you would have heated discussions. You would have your cultural wars as well. But the fact is, each one of those individuals within the community, well, they knew each other. And that meant that they could not be the most heated of enemies because they were viewed as being human beings. When we look at the issues that are very much tied to tolerance, and here I'm looking not necessarily at identity groups, although it's very much the way that we pigeonhole all of this. Or better said, it's the identity that we take on as a moniker, very much aligned with our lifestyle, those individuals that we associate with, the prevalent opinion to be found within that group. And that estrangement is not, as mentioned, it's not a new phenomenon, but I think it's taken up a fair amount of steam over the last 30, 35 years, depending upon where your location is, where it's become much more efficient for us to pigeonhole individuals and put them into those categories, because that brings order in our world, our own individual world. It doesn't necessarily bring order to the cosmos, because that's not going to happen. That one's not going to happen. But we take all of these thoughts and we live under this illusion that by putting individuals into categorization, into buckets, then that's how we bring order. And fits our dualistic way of looking at things. Because once they have been typecast into whatever role we're putting them in, well, that's where they belong and they can't get out. But it's even worse than that, because now we start believing that that's the way we are. And we do not allow ourselves the leeway to have a change of opinion. To figure out ways to reach out to other groups that might have a different way of looking at things. So as I alluded to earlier, this inclusion that we desperately need is become very difficult due to the structures that we have created within our society. a fact is a fact unless it is no longer a fact. So the question I pose is, are you able to recognize that it's no longer a fact? We have gone through a number of experiences over the last 15 years, starting perhaps with 2008, with the ability to, what I never thought I would ever see in my lifetime, is to elect a black president of the United States. Although it did not lead to the truth and reconciliation that a number of us were hoping for, because the tides were too strong, specifically going back to this idea of the groups. And unfortunately, that election helped in establishing the polarization that was already there, but became much more pronounced. Then there was 2016, where we thought that people would come to their senses and a number of us went through some very severe cognitive dissonance. And of course, the latest chapter is one that we tend to think that we live in peace and harmony in Europe, but we were unfortunately reminded that that is not always the case, going back to February of this year. And a lot of this is tied to the narrative that we have accepted, the narrative that we've been receiving, and that narrative becomes a source of convenience because it doesn't require us to think. We receive the story, we acknowledge the story without actually taking in the contents of that, of what is actually being said. And then we get real good in passing on that narrative to others, because that's really what's expected, huh? And that problem that we have once we've come to the conclusion that that narrative is not quite correct. We're so worried how other people are going to react when we do not continue to spout out that narrative. We might look at ourselves in a lesser light because we needed to change our opinion, as if that is not allowed, that we are not allowed to change our opinion. So it starts with the internal. And then we're deathly worried that once we start changing the narrative on the external, the reaction to those others within our identity group, how they're going to react. I think we've talked about this in numerous levels in previous shows. But the most poignant for me is the example that we talked about tied to class and those class values. And if you are looking to aspire for something much greater, quote unquote, whatever greater might be, that very possibly to be accepted within that new identity group will require you to toss overboard those things that were part of your previous narrative. We talked about the straddlers working within various levels of society and how they actually walk that societal tightrope. The simplicity of putting together a narrative and trying to explain something that is actually quite complicated. Well, the narrative allows us to explain it in a very simple way. And let's face it, there are a number of things that are not so clear-cut. And we as human beings have a clear need for closure. We don't like things to be open. So that narrative in putting together closure, even though it doesn't exist, it covers a need that we have. And that need is expediency. That's something that we are constantly striving for, because ambiguity is not part of the program. No siree. But this question of tolerance really starts with the individual. And part of it is tied to the ability to actually ask yourself the question, so what are your beliefs? What do you believe in? That's something that we don't do quite often, simply because we might be afraid of what that answer is going to be. That you come to the conclusion that you've been doing a number of things for what it seems to be an eternity, and it's become part of your persona, or the persona that you see, that is the one that you are trying to pass out to everybody that you identify with, because it all becomes a circle of isolation. But without being able to ask ourselves, so what do we actually believe in, then the question has to be raised as far as our own purpose. How can we actually even establish it? In an interesting conversation with somebody yesterday, somebody that I've been in contact with for a number of years, and he was talking about it, an assignment that he had as a consultant, and it was all tied to this client he was working for, and the people in upper management were deathly afraid to pass on performance metrics onto the employees. And it sounded to me that that dilemma had multiple levels. One of them was the lack of transparency that existed between upper management and the rest of the organization. Another one was tied to the ability to have those uncomfortable conversations that are unfortunately very often required if indeed we really want to make any type of progress. And it's not one of those things that you wake up in the morning and said, today I'm going to have one awful conversation and I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to make me squirm, it's going to make them squirm. Can't wait. We don't wake up that way. But when we talk about tolerance, and if we don't know what we stand for, then first of all, we can't convey it. We end up becoming more like parakeets that repeat those things that we've been told, and we believe that it's almost like the party line. And that means that we lose the ability to have those conversations with others. So let's call this one the conversations we won't have. We won't have them. So I'm going to pose some questions for you, some things for you to ponder. And I'll be thinking about them at the same time, so you won't be alone. So if it helps, go skedaddle and get a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen, and feel free to go ahead and write them all down. Or if you're listening to this in a podcast form, don't hesitate to rewind. Okay, so the first question is going to be, what's one conversation that is hard for you to initiate? And to make this one fair, let me try to answer some of these. And this is completely spontaneous, folks. I didn't plan any of this. What's the one conversation that's hard for me to initiate? I think it's very often tied to forgiveness. That I might feel that in professing forgiveness that I swallow my pride, and perhaps that might be one of the most difficult things. I'm sure there's probably a number of those types of conversations I haven't really thought of before. So as you can see, tipping point can also be a source of self-reflection. And I think I almost got to the second part of this scenario. What's at stake? And I think in this particular case, yeah, it's pride. And when you think about it, this idea of pride has everything to do with tolerance. Because if you feel that one group has more power, or they might have more prestige, or popularity, I do believe there are differences between those words, that our own pride sinks because we are continuously, let's try this again, Mike, continuously on this comparison bandwagon, the comparison merry-go-round. So what's at stake is our own pride. What's an ideal resolution looking like for you? Well, the ideal would be that it corrects itself and you don't have to bother. That would be the ideal. But I'm afraid that ideal is not very easy to reach. So let's see if we can go to plan B, huh? Let's go to plan B. So the ideal resolution is that you're able to develop some peace and closure. Closure, I think, would be a big one. And it's an ability to leave something behind. And relief. Relief would also fall in that category. The next question is, what does an ideal resolution look like for your counterpart? And in fact, just by posing that question, I'm coming to the conclusion that from that ideal resolution, there's a lot that can be added there. What's one of those phrases that you're looking to hear from others quite often, but the situation never arises so that you can have that moment? And I think one of the phrases that immediately comes to mind is, "I never knew that you felt that way." Or, "I never saw that side of you before, and I kind of like it." Or, "You are much more versatile than I ever realized." Or maybe, "Oh, you have your act together much more than I ever thought." And these are just some random thoughts that are coming into my mind. And if we can consider those uncomfortable moments that we really try to avoid at all costs because we're afraid that it's a ticking time bomb and it's just going to lead us in a direction that we don't really want to go down today. Come on, the sun is shining. We want to have a joyous day, and this one's just going to drag us down. That's our feeling. But if you can imagine if you had that conversation, and I'm just kind of playing the tapes how they usually go. They start off pretty raw because we don't know how to approach it. Starts off raw and then it goes downhill pretty quick. And then somewhere within that conversation, either you break or the others break or the other person breaks. I'm assuming it's a one-on-one. Doesn't have to be, of course. That something's going to be said that is going to be a tipping point in that conversation. And it's going to cause a reaction. Let's assume that the other person was the one who makes a comment like, "The fact is, I can't cope," or "The fact is, I don't think I'm worthy," or maybe, "You know what, you just remind me that I'm a loser. So when you hear those types of comments, and they might even be coming from yourself and you don't even realize you said it until the words got up and said, whoops, I did it again. Usually that's a turning point, and very often that changes the tone of how the rest of the conversation goes. And then the conversation isn't as raw, or actually is still very raw, but not in the same context as how it started. We've brought vulnerability into the conversation. We have brought, hopefully, caring into the conversation, compassion into the conversation, understanding definitely into the conversation. And the good thing is, if all goes well, you will never look at those people or that person the same way again. And I personally consider that to be extremely positive, because that meant that you were able to free yourself of those mental models that we have created, that perhaps we have been conditioned to believe based upon that image that we have of ourselves, and that mental model is just the structures that we use to present that mirror that we hold up looking at ourselves. So if all goes well, you do not look at that other person the same way, and you do not look at yourself the same way. And that could be scary. There was one more question. Here suggested to jot down a few words about whatever that may be, looking at that scenario, allowing you to perhaps reflect a little bit about that situation that has not yet come, but we've seen that movie more than once. And you might be asking at this point in time, what does this have to do with tolerance? Well, getting back to what I mentioned prior to us believing that bigger is always better, and that our base was either our neighborhood or the town we lived in, much smaller confines, regardless. That you can only treat others as being the enemy if you do not look at them as being human beings with faults and desires, and certain attributes that we kind of wish we had ourselves sometimes. Only when we're able to break these things down can we truly make progress in developing that inclusive society that, let's face it, folks, that's what we need. And we keep talking about this certainly on a corporate level. When we hear environmental, social, and governance, really, it's all about diversity on the outside, but inclusiveness on the inside, and making sure that not only do you have people from different groupings, but they actually are allowed to talk. and we take their words seriously, and we might learn something, and we become better as individuals by allowing ourselves to create that type of atmosphere. And there are certain things that we can use from those that have been before us that can be quite useful. One I think is quite interesting, one I've stumbled across recently. It's called the paradox of tolerance, and that came from Sir Karl Popper. And Popper was kind of purported an idea that might almost sound to be counterintuitive. And the statement that I ran across is that within this paradox of tolerance, in order to maintain a tolerant society, the society must be intolerant of intolerance. And this falls directly in line with what I mentioned in the beginning, that if we have structures that do not allow for us to develop tolerance, then we shouldn't be surprised if we are not tolerant. So it really does come down to the structures that we create. Now, the creation, I've spent a lot of time on the show talking about the individual. Perhaps let's veer out from you and me, and let's look at our community and look at the structures. And that community could be larger. Here in Vienna, we have 1.9 million people. Let's call that one a community, because actually when you walk down the streets of Vienna, you're always running across, at least I do, I run across people that I know all the time. So that's pretty much like a community to me. So let's look at the structures that we've put into place that are definitely getting in the way of us having that tolerant and inclusive society. Well, the first one is agency, that we have a number of individuals within our society that do not feel empowered. They do not feel that they are being taken serious. They feel like second-class citizens. And here I'm not referring exclusively to migrants, although going back to an event that took place last week that I was involved in, where I was very surprised in the negativity to be found within a number of migrant groups, where they feel now it's our turn, which isn't going to work, but okay, never mind. But we have a whole slew of different groups that feel that they're not being taken seriously. And I alluded to one of the groups, and those that are the quote-unquote non-educated, where we equate education as being knowledge, which couldn't be farther from the truth, but never mind. So very often, we just don't get together with these different groups and to find out, so what is their situation? Just go to listen and hear what they have to say. And it doesn't mean that everything that people say are constructive. And I'm afraid I'll go ahead and include yours truly in that one. We try, but we're not always successful. So, can we understand why people feel the way they do? There is some underlying rationale or impetus that brings people to a certain point. Well, was it their destiny, quote unquote, that we can change if we're willing to throw the baggage from yesterday overboard, right? Can we set up those uncomfortable conversations where we know that some of the things that are going to be said are going to be raw? They might not necessarily always be politically correct either. So if we're insisting that conversations are always PC compliant, then I'm afraid we are not going to have these uncomfortable conversations. But the fact is, folks, we're going to need to have them if we're ever going to make any progress. And if we could figure out ways for people not to immediately think that if somebody goes off on a tangent that might be associated with the identity that we find ourselves to be in, that actually it has nothing to do with us. We have to get off our individual high horse and come to the conclusion that very often it has nothing to do with us. And figure out ways to free ourselves of that hang-up. So can you imagine that world where we're able, within our community, whatever we define our community to be, that we're able to get that heterogeneous group together and have those uncomfortable conversations? So if I can give you all an assignment, and I'm giving this to myself, in fact, this is not a new assignment for me. I'm going to read off those questions again. And I'd like you to think about how these questions actually pertain to that situation we have within our society where that tolerance is something that we really need to work on, all of us. So what's that one conversation that's hard for us to initiate? And what is at stake? And here I'd like to add something addition, especially looking at the divisions that we have in our society. What is at stake if we don't do this? Do the problems just go away? My personal take is that they've gotten much worse simply because we are not willing or capable of taking on that conversation. And so the stakes have actually grown infinitely over the years. What's the ideal resolution looking like when looking at tolerance? What are we actually resolving? Are they our stereotypes that we hold from each other? The stereotypes that allow us to look at the others as being non-human? What about the resolution for the others? Very possibly might be tied to things that are very, very simple, like respect. That they are respected as being human beings. That they're respected for being different. That they're respected for being equal. So let's say we have those conversations in whatever way that we can manage it. Then what do we do then? Are we done? Are we done after we've had that uncomfortable conversation? I don't think so. I think we're only beginning. And in spite of all of the conditioning that we've been getting throughout our entire lives, none of this is linear. It's more like a pendulum, and that means we'll make one step forward and we possibly might even make 2 steps back. But it makes it much easier if we are mentally prepared for that taking place, instead of us getting there and saying, how in the hell did that happen? Which is the way we usually do it. So we should be prepared that there's going to be that 2-step back part that we're going to have to face up to. So that means we need to figure out a way to regroup. We have to figure out a way to de-escalate, because escalation is the one that we love. We love it. We love it so much. So how do we perform the de-escalation? That we turn down the volume, and we turn off the rhetoric. We turn up the understanding, and we focus on the listening. And so let's assume, for simplicity's sake, that we have been able to get past this point with the 2 steps back, okay? Are you with me? Then I think we're getting a little bit closer to that ideal that I mentioned, certainly from my perspective, that we're able to accept others' opinions, and that does not negate our own, because it can't negate our own, because our opinions are based upon those things that we believe in. And of course, I'm making a huge prerequisite here that we already performed that internal exercise, that we know what we believe in, what we stand for, and those are the things that give us purpose. And it also allows us to, together with all the other stakeholders within our community, to create those new structures, the new structures that are clearly required for us to build that community of inclusion that I personally am truly clamoring for. And I'm hoping that I was able to make that concept a little bit more attractive to you within the last 50 some odd minutes. So where does that leave us now? Here are some of the things that I am hoping are some takeaways that it starts with us as individuals. Not with us being the focus of everything that takes place, but rather the change starts within. Because only after we are able to feel empowered, have a sense of agency, that we personally feel that we're worthy, that we have respect for ourselves. Only at that point in time are we ever going to be able to convey that to others in a way that will not be considered to be a threat anymore. Be ready and embrace the uncomfortable conversations. Be ready for the awakening that if those uncomfortable conversations go as well as I think they can, if you allow them to. Then that allows us, together within our community, to take on a new trajectory in moving things in a direction that really truly makes us inclusive and makes us dynamic, and it really makes the place that we live something very special. I believe this is possible. And I hope that I made a little bit of progress in maybe getting you to believe that too. And I have reached the end. And I appreciate you being tolerant to a fault with me. I hope I was able to give you something to think about, something positive, something meaningful. And look forward to the next opportunity to spend this time with you. For that, I'm very grateful. Thank you.